The morning she came north, the train was late, and the platform at Moose Jaw was empty, except for a man selling coffee from a tin pot and a dog sleeping under the bench. She had one bag. She set it down and waited. The man who was supposed to meet her was not there. She drank the coffee standing up. It was November, and the cold came off the rails in long, flat waves. She had been on the train since Winnipeg, and before that she had been in a house that no longer felt like hers. And before that she had been someone's wife. And before that she had been someone who believed things turned out the way you planned them if you worked hard enough. She had been wrong about that last part for long enough that she'd stopped thinking about it. She waited 40 minutes. Then she picked up her bag and asked the coffee man where the Halverson place was. He looked at her. "You the woman Halverson sent for?" "I'm the woman who answered an advertisement," she said. "That's all I know." He pointed north and described a road. She walked it. The property sat 2 miles outside of town, past a stand of spruce that blocked the wind and a fence that had been repaired in places and not repaired in others. She could tell which sections were old and which were recent by the way the posts leaned. The recent ones leaned too. Nobody had bothered to tamp them properly. She stood at the gate and looked at what she'd come to. The house was 2 stories, wood frame. The paint so weathered it had gone back to gray. One shutter hung at an angle from a single hinge. The porch steps, 3 of them, had a board missing on the middle one, the gap wide enough to catch a boot heel. The barn was larger than the house and in better repair, which told her something about the man. Or had told her something about who he used to be. Smoke came from the chimney. That was something. She unlatched the gate and went up to the house, stepping over the gap in the stairs, and knocked. Nobody answered. She knocked again, then tried the door. It opened. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and something burned and left too long. There was a cast iron pan on the stove with the remnants of something that had once been porridge. A coffee pot, cold. On the table, a ledger open to a page of figures that didn't add up. She could see that from where she stood, without even trying. She put her bag down beside the door and went to the stove. The fire in the box was low but not out. She added wood from the stack beside it. She found a cloth and moved the pan off the heat. She found a kettle and filled it from the pump at the sink, which required 6 full strokes before it ran clear. She was looking for a proper coffee tin when she heard boots on the porch. He came through the door the way a man comes through a door when he's been outside and is not expecting company, head down, pulling off gloves, and he stopped when he saw her. He was older than the advertisement had suggested. Not old, but the kind of tired that adds years to a face whether a man has earned them or not. He had dark hair gone gray at the temples, a beard that had not been tended recently, and one arm held slightly differently from the other. She noticed that. The right shoulder sat lower, and when he pulled the glove from his right hand, he did it with more care than the left. "You're Halverson," she said. "You're early," he said. The advertisement said November 4th. It's November 4th. He looked at the stove, at the kettle, at the pan she'd moved. His face did not change. "I was going to meet the train. I walked." He said nothing to that. She found the coffee. She put it on. Then she turned and looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at things she needed to understand, without softening it, without looking away first. "I'd like to know what the position involves," she said. The advertisement said ranch help and household management. "I'd like to know what that means in practice." He sat down at the table. He didn't offer her a seat. She took one anyway. 12 horses, he said. Quarter horse stock, mostly. 3 mares I'm wintering over for a man in Swift Current, 2 of my own, a stallion I'd rather not have to discuss, and the rest are working animals. They need to be fed twice a day, turned out when the weather allows, and checked for anything wrong. The barn needs mucking. There's fence work that should have been done in October. Didn't get done? What else? The house is what it is. The house, she said, needs more than I can fix, so I'll need to know what's actually important to you. She said it the same way she might say anything else, a fact, not a confrontation. The middle step on the porch is missing a board. That's a hazard and it's cheap to fix. The shutter on the east window won't survive another wind. That's also cheap. The kitchen is manageable. What I can't tell yet is the rest. He was looking at her the way people look at something they expected to go one way and it went another. There's a boy, he said. She waited. My son, he's 8. He boards in town during the week at Mrs. Elspeth Cantor's place because the roads in winter. He stopped. He comes home Fridays. What time Fridays? 4 o'clock, more or less. She nodded. That was the most important thing he'd said, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and kept one for herself. He looked at the cup for a moment before he picked it up. The advertisement said household manager, she said. Not wife. That's right. I want to be clear about that. So do I, he said. And something in his voice, not relief exactly, but a kind of loosening, told her he was telling the truth. She took the room off the kitchen. It was small and had a window that faced the barn and a bed with a wool blanket that smelled like cedar and something else she didn't try to name. She put her bag in the corner. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and looked at the window. Outside, the light was already going. In November this far north, it went early and came late, and in between the sky was the color of old pewter. She had not been this far north in 7 years. She had been somewhere warmer and greener, and it had not saved her from anything. She made a list. Not on paper. She made it in her head the way she always made lists, walking through the problem room by room, item by item, prioritizing by risk and then by cost and then by what could wait. The step, the shutter, the pump seal which was getting worn, the fence sections that had not been properly tamped. The barn needed lime on the floor of 2 stalls she'd noted from the doorway. The ledger needed someone to sit with it. She didn't add the boy to the list. He wasn't a problem. But she added him to her thinking. 8 years old, boarding in town, coming home Fridays. She thought about what that meant, and then she stopped thinking about it because it wasn't her business yet. In the morning, she would start. Halverson was already in the barn when she came out at 5:30. She could see the light through the gap under the door. She went in, and he was at the far end, working on the stallion's left rear shoe with his back to her, and she could see by the set of his shoulders that he was compensating. Right side doing less, adjusting without thinking about it, the way old injuries make you move. She went to the feed room and found what she needed and started at the near end of the stalls. They worked without speaking for the better part of an hour. The horses were good animals. She could tell a great deal about a man by the condition of his horses, and these were not neglected. They were clean, they were healthy, their hooves were in order except for the one he was working on now. Whatever else had slipped on this property, the horses hadn't. She noted that. When she came to the 3rd stall from the end, she stopped and looked at the floor and went back to the feed room and found the bag of lime and came back. This stall, she said. He looked over from what he was doing. I know, the one beside it too. He didn't answer. That meant he knew that too. She did the lime and moved on. At 7, she went back to the house and made eggs and toast and put it on the table. He came in 15 minutes later. He washed his hands at the pump, dried them on the cloth she'd hung by the sink, and sat down and ate without comment. She ate at the other end of the table with her own plate. The fence on the northwest side, she said. 3 posts need resetting. He looked up. I can do 2 of them. The 3rd one needs 2 people. He looked back at his plate. We'll get to it. Before the ground freezes harder, she said, not pushing, just placing the information where he could find it. Yes, he said. Before then, she found the grave on the 3rd day. It was behind the house, on a small rise she'd walked past twice without noticing because the grass had grown up around the marker, and the ground had settled into the landscape like it had always been there. A wooden cross, well made. Someone had taken time with it. The cross piece was fitted, not nailed at an angle, and there were no words on it except a name, Clara, and 2 years 11 apart. She stood there for a moment. The wind moved the dry grass around the base of the marker. She didn't say anything to him about it. It wasn't her to bring up, but she thought about the way he carried his shoulder, and the ledger with the figures that had stopped being tended sometime in the spring, and the shutter hanging from its one hinge, and the step that no one had fixed. And she understood the shape of it, even if she didn't know the details. Grief doesn't always look like grief. Sometimes it looks like a man who stops repairing things. She went back to what she'd been doing. Friday came cold and clear. She had the kitchen warm, and there was soup on the stove and bread she'd made Thursday that morning. And at 4:15 she heard boots on the porch. Small boots, quick on the boards, and the door opened. The boy came in the way children come through doors when they've been away and come home, all at once in a rush of cold air and noise. He was 8, like his father had said, with the same dark coloring and an expression that was more alert than wary. He stopped when he saw her. "You're the lady," he said. "I am," she said. "Papa said you were coming." He did. He put his bag down by the door, the same spot where she'd put hers the first day, and looked at the soup. "Is that for supper?" "It is." He looked at her again, reassessing, and apparently decided something, because he took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door and went to wash his hands without being asked. His name was Liam. She learned this not from Halverson but from the boy himself, who told her within the first 10 minutes that his name was Liam, that he was in grade 3, that Mrs. Cantor's house had a cat named Jeffrey who slept on the stairs, and that he had lost a tooth on Tuesday. He showed her the gap with great pride. She listened to all of it. Halverson came in at supper time and sat down across from the boy, and the conversation between them was spare. A few questions, short answers. But the boy filled in around the edges with enough talking for all three of them. She watched the way Halverson's face changed when the boy was in the room. Not dramatically, but the set of his jaw was different. Some tension went out of it. She ate her soup and kept her own counsel. The ledger was her 3rd week's project. She waited until Halverson went into town for supplies, then sat down at the table with the ledger and a clean sheet of paper and worked through it. It took the better part of a morning. The records went back 3 years, tidy in the beginning, the handwriting even, the columns clean, and then, about 14 months ago, they began to loosen. Numbers written in a different hand, hers she thought, or begun to be, and then not finished. Lines left blank, totals that didn't follow from their rows. What she found when she got to the bottom of it was not catastrophic. It was close to it, but not there yet. 3 months behind on a note to the bank in Regina. Feed costs that had crept up because he hadn't renegotiated with the supplier the way the previous entries showed he used to. The swift current mares were bringing in income that wasn't being tracked properly, which meant he was probably underreporting what he owed in commission. He wasn't a careless man. He was a man who had stopped paying attention. There was a difference. She made her own clean copy of the accounts, current figures, what was actually owed, what was actually coming in, what needed to happen in what order. She set it on the table where he'd find it. She didn't explain it. She didn't leave a note. Either it would land or it wouldn't. He came home at 4 and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the papers on the table for a long moment without picking them up. Then he picked them up. He stood there reading them, and she was at the sink not watching him, and the only sound in the kitchen was the stove ticking and the wind starting up outside. "This is wrong," he said finally. "Which part?" "The commission I owe Hargreaves. I calculated it different." She turned around. "Show me." He showed her. She looked at what he'd done and found where the error was and showed him back. He looked at it for a moment and then set the paper down. "The bank," he said. 3 months. He was quiet. "It's manageable," she said. "If you go in before Christmas, they're more likely to work with you if you go in. Less likely if they have to come looking." He didn't say thank you. She hadn't expected him to. He picked up the papers and took them to the desk in the corner of the front room. And she heard the drawer open and the papers go in, and the drawer close. That evening he fixed the step on the porch. She heard the hammer going after supper when the boy was doing his reading at the table. She didn't remark on it. The stallion was the problem she'd been waiting for. He was a big animal, 16 hands, dark bay, the kind of horse that had been trained well and knew it, and had opinions about everything that happened in his vicinity. She'd been leaving him alone, working around him, getting him used to her voice and her presence, without pushing for more than that. It took patience. She had patience. The trouble came on a Wednesday in December when a delivery truck came up the road and backfired twice near the barn. The stallion went sideways in his stall, broke the latch, and got loose in the barn with 3 of the other horses. She was in the feed room. She heard it. She came out slowly. She assessed. The stallion was at the far end of the barn, nostrils wide, moving in tight circles. The other 3 horses were pressed to the sides of their stalls, unsettled but contained. The main barn door was closed. She was between him and the exit. She did not move quickly. She moved the way you move with an animal that is frightened, steadily, without hesitation. but without aggression. She talked to him in a low, continuous voice, not asking anything yet, just letting him hear her. And she walked a long, slow arc around the outside of the space until she was at his shoulder, and then she stood still. He shook his head once, stamped. She waited. He did not move away from her. She put her hand on his neck. He flinched and then didn't. She walked him back to his stall by the halter she'd had in her hand the entire time. She'd picked it up from the hook by the feedroom door without breaking stride. An old habit. And she fixed the latch with a piece of wire until it could be properly repaired. Halverson had come into the barn during the last part of this. She hadn't heard him come in. When she turned around, he was standing near the door. "The latch needs a new pin," she said. "The wire will hold overnight." He nodded. Then, "Where did you learn that?" "My father had horses," she said. "A long time ago." He didn't ask more. She didn't offer more. It was the most they had said to each other about her life before she arrived, and it was enough for now. Christmas came and went quietly. Liam was home for 2 weeks, and the house was different with him in it. Louder, warmer, in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. He had made something at school from pine cones and ribbon, and he hung it on the kitchen door with great ceremony. He wanted to help with the horses. She let him do what was safe and talked him through what wasn't. And he absorbed all of it with the particular seriousness of a boy who wanted to be useful. On Christmas Day, Halverson made pancakes in the morning, and she noted that he was a better cook than the burned porridge of her first day had suggested. She did not say so. She ate the pancakes and helped Liam assemble the wooden puzzle his father had gotten him. And in the afternoon, she walked out to the barn alone, while the two of them played cards at the kitchen table. And she stood in the quiet for a while, listening to the horses move in their stalls. And she thought about the previous year's Christmas, which she did not want to think about, and then she stopped. The land was good here. She had not expected to think that. But the country north of Moose Jaw had a quality to it she'd felt before in places she'd stayed. A flatness that was not emptiness, a space that pushed back if you paid attention to it. The sky in winter was extraordinary. She had started noticing that on her morning walks to the barn, the way the light came in at an angle different from anywhere she'd been, pink and then gold, and then a hard, clear white that made the snow look like something deliberate. She had been in worse places. She went back inside. It was February when she found the folder. She had not been looking for anything. She was reorganizing the desk in the front room. She'd asked, he'd agreed. And she found it in the back of the lower drawer, behind the papers she'd given him, and several years of correspondence with the bank in Regina and a letter from someone in Saskatoon that she didn't read. The folder was thin. It contained the papers for the property, the original land grant, a survey from 1989, and underneath those, a loan agreement she hadn't seen in the ledger. She read it carefully. The loan was from Halverson's brother-in-law, not a bank, a private note dated 2 years ago, at terms that were reasonable at the time, but included a clause she would not have agreed to, the property as collateral, a call provision that allowed the lender to demand full repayment within 60 days on written notice. She sat with this for a while. Then she put the folder back where she'd found it and finished reorganizing the desk and said nothing. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about whether it was her business. She decided it was. Because if the note was called in, nothing else she'd done here for 3 months would matter. The latch on the stallion's stall, the clean copy of the accounts, the lime on the barn floor, none of it would matter. On the third day, over supper, Liam was back in town. It was a Tuesday, she said. "There's a folder in the lower desk drawer." He looked at her. "I wasn't searching," she said. "I was reorganizing." He said nothing. "The call provision in that note concerns me," she said. "Has anything changed with that relationship?" He set his fork down. He looked at his plate. Then he looked at the window, the way a person looks at something that isn't there. "He's not a bad man," he said. "He was Clara's brother." She waited. "We haven't spoken much since." He stopped. "I don't think he'd call it, but I don't know. If things were in better order," she said carefully, "you could refinance it through the bank. At this point, with the accounts looking the way they do now." He was quiet for a long time. "I didn't look at that folder after I put it in there," he said. "I know. I didn't look at most things. I know that too." He picked his fork back up. He ate the rest of the supper without saying anything. She did the same. In the morning, he asked her to come with him to the bank in Regina. The meeting at the bank took an hour. She sat beside him with her clean copy of the accounts in a folder on her lap and answered 3 questions the manager directed at her and let Halverson do the rest. He was a different man in that office than he'd been when she arrived. Not a different person. The same bones, the same reticence, the same careful way of holding his right arm, but present in a way he hadn't been on the porch that first night, chewing out words about horses. He'd looked at the accounts. He'd learned them. He knew his own numbers. She had suspected this about him somewhere in the first week, from the quality of the old ledger entries before they fell apart. He had been good at this once. He could be again. The note was restructured. The call provision was removed. The terms were manageable. They drove back to Moose Jaw in his truck, in the particular silence of 2 people who have just done something difficult together and don't need to talk about it. Outside the window, the prairie in February was white and enormous, and the road ran straight north, and the sky was already doing its thing. That low gold light at 4 o'clock that lasted only 20 minutes, and she'd taken to going outside specifically to watch it. "Why did you come?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like something he'd been thinking and said aloud. She thought about how to answer that. "The advertisement described a working position," she said. "I needed a working position." He nodded slowly. She knew that wasn't all of it, and he probably knew it too. But it was true as far as it went, and sometimes that was sufficient. Spring came slowly, the way it comes to Saskatchewan, not all at once but in stages. The snow pulling back from the south side of things first, the mud arriving before the warmth, the light changing a week before the temperature did. She noticed each stage. She had started writing some of it, down in the small notebook she'd carried north, and never opened until March. Liam came home for spring break and spent 3 days following her through the barn with the focused attention of a child who has decided something is interesting and intends to understand it completely. She taught him to check a hoof properly. She showed him how to read the weight of a horse by looking at the hip bones and the ribs. He had his father's way of listening, still, serious, retaining things. The fence went up properly in April. She and Halverson worked it together over 3 days. The posts tamped this time, the wire tight, the gates hung level. It was hard work, and they did it without much talking, which was fine. She had learned that the silences between them were not uncomfortable. They were the silences of 2 people who each had work to do and did it. The mares from Swift Current went back in May. In their place, 2 new ones arrived, a deal Halverson had put together over the winter with a breeder north of Saskatoon. He'd worked it out himself, negotiated the terms, brought her the numbers to review. She'd made 2 suggestions, and he'd taken one of them, which was the right one to take. She reviewed the ledger herself now, each Sunday evening at the kitchen table. This had not been formally arranged. It had simply become what happened on Sundays. Halverson left her to it, and she left notes on the margin in pencil if she found anything to flag. He read the notes and did what needed doing. By June, the property note had been paid down, not retired, but meaningfully reduced, ahead of schedule. She didn't say anything about that. She didn't need to. One evening in July, Liam was sitting on the repaired porch steps after supper, turning a piece of pale yellow stone over in his hands that he'd found near the creek. She was in the kitchen washing up. She could hear him asking his father something. She couldn't make out the words. She heard Halverson answer in his usual way, measured, brief, and then the boy said something else, and there was a pause, and Halverson said something that made the boy laugh. She stood at the sink and listened to the boy laugh on the porch in the July evening. She had not planned to stay. She thought about this while she dried the plates and set them in the cupboard and hung the cloth up. She had come north for a working position. She had found one. She had made herself useful, and the property was in better shape than when she'd arrived, and the accounts were in order, and the note was being paid down, and the boy had learned to check a hoof properly, and the fence was level. She had not planned to stay past spring. It was July. She hung up the cloth. Through the window over the sink, she could see the barn, and the light coming from the open door of it, and one of the mares grazing in the paddock beyond the fence they'd fixed together, and behind that, the sky doing what the prairie sky did at this hour, going slow and enormous and impossible, through the colors she'd started noticing in November and hadn't stopped noticing since. She had been in worse places. She had planned carefully and lost everything anyway, and she had come north because she needed a working position, and she had found one and she had stayed. The question of why she had stayed past spring was not a complicated one, she decided. It did not require much examination. The answer was the barn at 5:30 in the morning, and the ledger on Sundays, and Liam's tooth he'd shown her with such pride, and the light in November, and the fence they'd hung level in April, and the man who had been good at his life once and was becoming good at it again, slowly the way a post heals into ground when it has been properly tamped. She went out to the porch. Liam looked up. Halverson looked up. The stone passed from the boy's hand to his father's and back again. She sat down on the top step, and the three of them watched the prairie light go out in its unhurried way. And there was nothing to say that needed saying, and so they didn't say it, and the evening settled around the property like it had always been hers.